Imagine you walk into a room. A scientist in a lab coat tells you to press a button. The button delivers an electric shock to a stranger in the next room. The stranger screams. The scientist says, "Continue." Would you press it again? Most people say no. Most people are wrong. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram ran one of the most disturbing experiments in the history of science, and what he found changed everything we thought we knew about human nature. 65% of ordinary people pressed that button all the way to the end, and the end was 450 volts, enough to kill a person. To understand why Milgram did this, we need to go back to 1961. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Holocaust, had just begun in Jerusalem. Eichmann's defense was simple. He was just following orders, and the world was left with a terrifying question that nobody wanted to answer. Were the people who carried out the Holocaust genuinely evil, or were they ordinary people who found themselves inside an extraordinary situation? Stanley Milgram, a young psychologist at Yale University, decided to find out. Not with theories, with an experiment. One that would shake the foundations of psychology and that we are still talking about 60 years later. The setup was simple: 3 people in a building at Yale University. The first was the experimenter, a stern man in a gray lab coat, the authority figure. The second was the teacher, an ordinary volunteer who had responded to a newspaper ad. They thought they were participating in a study about memory and learning. The third was the learner strapped to a chair in a separate room connected to electrodes. What the teacher didn't know was that the learner was an actor, and the shocks were completely fake. The teacher's job was to ask the learner a series of questions. Every wrong answer meant a shock, and with every wrong answer the voltage went up. 15 volts, 30 volts, 45. All the way up to 450, a level marked on the machine with the words, "Danger, severe shock, XXX." As the voltage increased, the learner, the actor, began to react. At 75 volts, he grunted. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released. At 180 volts, he screamed that he couldn't stand the pain. At 300 volts, he refused to answer any more questions and went completely silent. At 330 volts, nothing. No response at all. And every time the teacher hesitated or tried to stop, the experimenter said 4 things in this exact order: "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. That was it. No threats. No punishment. Just 4 sentences from a man in a lab coat. Before running the experiment, Milgram asked a group of Yale psychology students to predict the results. They estimated that maybe 1 to 2% of people would go all the way to 450 volts. The real number was 65%. Not monsters, not soldiers, not people with dark histories, postal workers, engineers, teachers, accountants, ordinary Americans who had answered a newspaper ad and walked into a room at Yale University. Every single participant went to at least 300 volts, and 65%, nearly 2 out of 3 people, pressed the button at 450. The experiment was replicated across different countries, different cultures, different decades. The results were always roughly the same. So why did they do it? This is the question Milgram spent the rest of his career trying to answer, and the explanation he arrived at was both simple and deeply unsettling. He called it the Agentic State. The idea is this: when we enter a hierarchical structure, a workplace, an institution, an experiment, something shifts in how we see ourselves. We stop seeing ourselves as autonomous individuals responsible for our own choices. We start seeing ourselves as agents of someone else's will. We are just the instrument. They are the ones giving the orders. They are responsible, not us. This mental shift, Milgram argued, is not a sign of weakness or stupidity. It is a deeply ingrained social mechanism that allowed human societies to function, to build armies, institutions, organizations. The same mechanism that makes civilization possible also made the Holocaust possible. Milgram identified several specific factors that increased obedience. The first was proximity to authority. When the experimenter was in the room, obedience was highest. When he gave instructions by phone, it dropped significantly. Some participants even lied, saying they were continuing when they had stopped. The second was distance from the victim. When the learner was in a different room and the teacher could only hear screams, obedience was higher. When they were forced to physically touch the learner to administer the shock, obedience dropped sharply, out of sight, out of mind, and out of conscience. The third was the legitimacy of the institution. When the experiment was moved from Yale University to a rundown commercial building and presented as a private research company, obedience dropped by almost 20%. The lab coat and the university name were doing more work than anyone realized. Here is something important that often gets lost in the retelling. The people who obeyed were not comfortable. They were not cold or indifferent. They sweated. They trembled. They laughed nervously, a stress response, not amusement. Many begged the experimenter to stop the study. One man had a full seizure. They knew something was wrong, and they continued anyway. This is perhaps the most disturbing finding of all, not that people did it, but that they did it while feeling that it was wrong. Milgram called this the strain of obedience. The internal conflict was real and visible, but in the end, for most people, the authority of the situation was stronger than the authority of their own conscience. Now I want to ask you something directly. If you had been in that room, if you had walked into Yale University in 1961 thinking you were helping with a memory study, would you have stopped? Most people who hear about this experiment say yes, of course. I would have refused. I would have walked out. Milgram's colleagues thought the same thing before the study. The Yale psychology students thought the same thing, and 65% of them were wrong. This is not me saying you would have obeyed. This is me saying that the honest answer is, you don't know. None of us do. Because the power of the situation, the lab coat, the institution, the authority, the social pressure not to make a scene, is stronger than most of us want to believe. And the first step to resisting that power is admitting that it exists. Milgram's own research showed that obedience is not inevitable. In variations of the experiment, when participants saw another person refuse to continue, obedience dropped from 65% to just 10%. One act of defiance was enough to break the spell for most people. Social psychologists offer 3 concrete things you can do to strengthen your resistance to destructive authority. First, name what is happening out loud. Saying the words, "I am being pressured to do something I think is wrong," activates your autonomous reasoning and breaks the agentic state. Second, slow down. Obedience works fastest under urgency. The phrase, "it is absolutely essential that you continue," is designed to prevent reflection. Any pause that gives you time to think reduces compliance. Third, find one ally. You don't need to be the hero alone. One other person who shares your doubt is often enough to change the dynamic entirely. Milgram's experiment was criticized heavily for its ethics, and rightly so. Participants were deceived, and many experienced genuine psychological distress. Modern ethics boards would never approve a study like this today, but the knowledge it gave us is irreplaceable. We now know that the line between ordinary people and people who do terrible things is not drawn in character or morality. It is drawn in situation. Change the situation, and you change the behavior. That is both a terrifying thought and a deeply hopeful one, because it means that building a better world is not about finding better people. It is about building better systems, better institutions, and a culture that makes it normal, expected, even to question authority when something feels wrong. Stanley Milgram left us with one final thought that I want to leave you with too. He wrote, "It may be that we are puppets controlled by the strings of society, but at least we are puppets with perception, with awareness. And perhaps our awareness is the first step to our liberation." You now know what 65% of people in that room didn't know going in. Use it. If this made you think, subscribe. Every week we break down one psychology concept that actually changes how you see yourself and the world around you. Drop a comment below. Do you think you would have stopped? I read every single one. See you in the next video.